Steve Martin, Andy Kaufman, Monty Python, Kids in the Hall that inspired my comedy, but that guy gave me a tool. Like, he gave me something that made me better as a comedian.
Hey, what's up, everybody, and welcome to the Accolades conversation series, in which I talk to some of my favorite artists about who or what they would recommend me checking out. Make sure to subscribe or hit that like button. In episode 40, I spoke to Matt Besser, an American actor, comedian, director, producer, and writer, best known as one of the 4 founding members of the Upright Citizen Brigade sketch comedy troupe, who had their own show on Comedy Central from 1998 to 2000. He currently hosts the improvisation-based podcast Improv for Humans on the Earwolf podcasting network. I talked to Matt about Del Close, an American actor, writer, and teacher who coached many of the best-known comedians and comic actors of the late 20th century. In addition to an acting career in television and film, he was one of the influences on modern improvisational theater. Close is co-founder of the IO or IO Chicago, formerly known as ImprovOlympic. Coincidence or not, I started reading Bob Odenkirk's amazing new book, Comedy, Drama, the other day, which is definitely worth your time. Odenkirk, who you might know from Mr. Show, and you definitely know portraying Saul Goodman in Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, starts off his book all about Del Close. Here's a small quote. Del's journey to icon status as a trailblazing improv guru was just beginning, but he would inspire many, many others in the years to come. Even despite his legendary misogyny, many great female comic voices. He did a lot of good in the end, and all while fighting demons few others knew about, though they could guess it. Self-hatred, frustration, resentment, a lot of hurt feelings inside that guy. As Janet Coleman, author of The Compass, the best book on those early years of improvisation in American comedy, told me, you know what Del did, what was truly amazing? He didn't commit suicide. He figured out other things to do. End quote. So, without further ado, check out what Matt had to say about Del Close.
I watched your Jeffrey Lewis. I watched a lot of them, but I'm a big fan of Jeffrey Lewis in particular. Mm-hmm. So he turned me on to that woman. He accomplished his goal.
Exactly. I accomplished my goal as well at the same time, so that's good.
Right. You got me to watch him, and I listened to her. And now I know about her. All right. So I would like to give accolades to Del Close. Del Close was a comedic actor and also dramatic actor and director, but he was most known for being one of the inventors of the improvisational comedy. So it was always a loose form as long as anyone was ever making up words and trying to be funny, but there was a time period where it was really codified, and that started with Viola Spolin way back in the day. But this isn't about her, so I won't go that far back, and she wasn't really about making it for comedy per se. But then in the 50s and 60s, there started more interest of, let's do this for comedy, and plays are kind of boring. They don't really relate to the people that are out there in the chairs. They don't talk about what are going on now, an Ibsen or Brecht play. So let's just literally get a suggestion from the audience. What do you guys want to talk about? What do you guys want us to do a play about? So that's kind of the spirit that it started at the University of Chicago. With people like Del Close and Elaine May and Mike Nichols, but I would like to focus on Del Close because he's such an interesting guy. He started out in Manhattan, Kansas, a very small town. He joined a circus. How many people? That's such a storybook thing, but that's how he left his town, is joining the sideshow in a circus where he would literally swallow swords. Yes, Del Close could swallow swords. He was that kind of guy. But, he got down to more typical business of improv at this place called The Compass in St. Louis, which is where you could say maybe where Second City gets so much credit, maybe the Compass deserves a little bit more of being the place where they started this thing called the kitchen rules. which is where yes and came from, which is probably the most famous rule of our art form of improv comedy. So if you're in the art form, you're fascinated by where it started. And I don't know how many art forms have that too. Like, do we know when blues became rock and roll? I don't know if there's like those definitive moments like that in a lot of art forms. But in this art form, you can really trace it to these moments of these guys sitting down, and women, Elaine May, Ted Flicker in particular, at the Compass in St. Louis, and saying, let's come up with these rules that make improvising on stage easier so we don't fail so much. And they did it. Those rules last till today. And Del Close was I think the greatest preacher of those rules, and he brought it to another level and created, along with other people's help, at this place called the Committee in San Francisco, another improv theater. They came up with long form, which meant not only you're improvising a scene, you're connecting all the scenes into something that lasts longer, like a play. It goes like a half hour to an hour. So that was kind of a new concept back then. And they came up eventually with what they called the Herald, which was, in theory, like a half hour form where scenes would start different, like 3 different scenes. By the end of the form, the scenes are connecting. And that's what my group, the Upright Citizens Brigade, built our sketch show on, that was eventually on Comedy Central in that exact form. But long before that, people were performing the Herald as a form for audiences, and that was considered groundbreaking, because up till then, improv is only thought of as something to develop a written piece. So it was only something for behind the scenes before we took it in front of the audience. And Del and his contemporaries, but especially Del, said, no, it can be its own show. And this was literally an ongoing feud with him and Bernie Sahlins at Second City that went on decades, where Second City was like, we do written sketch shows and improv will be used for that. And Del's like, I can do a whole show. I don't need the written sketch. So, and there's much to be said about him directing at Second City, and how much he added to the sketch of SCTV, a famous sketch show, SNL. He coached people like John Belushi and Mike Myers. But I'm personally more fascinated by what he did for improv. He invented this thing called the Herald. And you can't make someone funny, and you really can't teach someone to be funny, but you can teach people to be funny together and to be better at being funny together. And I don't know if that's another unique thing to this form in comedy versus a lot of other art forms, where you don't need to work with other people. You can just do your own thing, but you have to work with other people when you're doing a scene. And there's ways to do it, and this guy did it. And so many art forms, the artist, like Chris Farley, who was one of his proteges, but you don't know the teacher. You don't know the guy who gave him those tools. So that's why I'd like to give accolades to Del Close.
So he was never known for anything but the art form. Like he wasn't never known for television or anything.
He wanted to be. He was like myself. I want more and bigger roles all the time as a comedic actor. He was in this show that I loved called Get Smart, which was kind of a parody of James Bond. It was a popular show back in the 60s. And he was in the horror movie, or one of the Blob movies. You can look that up. Mm-hmm. He had a nice role in The Untouchables. He was a teacher in Ferris Bueller. So you'll see him in a lot of those guys from Second City, the Committee, and the Compass of that era. A more famous guy, Howard Hessman, who was eventually on WKRP, who he passed away this last year, and he was one of the guys that also came up with the Herald. But he's that kind of guy of you'll see these character actors will go, oh yeah, I recognize him. But they always wanted more. And he, of course, that's who we are. We want more comedy to do. He had contemporaries of Elaine May and Mike Nichols. I just as easily could have given accolades to Elaine May, who I'm a huge fan, but she just got the Oscars, just gave her accolades a couple of weeks ago, just so she doesn't need me. But they did so much for sketch and improv that probably not a lot of people know unless they're obsessed with it.
Is there, for somebody who never done any improv, is it easy to explain the basic rules?
Well, I've thanks for a plug, but I've written a whole book on it. So I guess, in my opinion, it took 350 pages to explain them well. The most basic rule of improv is yes and it basically means don't deny the reality that your partner's creating. I improvise every night with my daughter, actually. And last night I had a discussion about denial, because the scene started off, I was like, my character said, well, it's Tuesday. And she goes, no, it's Wednesday. And I'm like, you can't do that in improv. You can't just say the fact that I just brought up is actually not the fact, it's this fact. I can't start a scene and go, well, doctor, and the person go, I'm not a doctor, you're at a Starbucks. That's gonna wreck the scene right away. So that's just a very basic rule. And you think, oh, well, obviously people wouldn't do that. Well, no, they do that. You got to give them, there's weird kind of basic human instincts that wreck improv scenes that you got to kind of train yourself out of. And it's, and they came up with those basics that you start with. And of course, those basics have been developed through the years to be much more complex. But yeah, that's the base, that phrase is kind of the phrase improv is known for, yes and that started with the kitchen rules.
And then maybe another question that might be obvious for you, but is there if you do improv, is there sometimes that you do like a set for like a half hour and you're like in the end and you're like, this was so great that you write it down, or like there's a story there?
Yeah, without question.
Yeah,
it used to be improv was kind of known, in my opinion, too much for failure. Like, oh, we fail most of the time, but that's part of the fun. By the time I think Dell had started training us, which was in the 90s, we wanted to get past that failure was fun, and let's just be successful. Let's just try to have a show where every scene works. And I think we got to that point. I got to the point where I didn't want to go, yeah, I love failing every once in a while. I felt like that was a weird thing we needed to put behind us as an art form. And I would say at our theater, the Upright Citizens Brigade Theater, no, you don't go there and see a show with a lot of failure. You see more success than failure. And to answer your question, when you do see success, it should be as good as a written scene. They used to say, you had to be there. I can't tell you about the improv show. You had to be there. In my opinion, if you had to be there, it wasn't that good. Because you can tell someone about a sketch you saw on Saturday Night Live last night and they'll understand it. Mm-hmm. So why can't they understand a good improv scene? So I think, and that's what we wrote probably when we had a sketch show on Comedy Central for 3 seasons. A third of the scenes came from our improv show ASCAT, which we videotaped. Yes, folks, videotapes, VHS tapes back then. We would tape them every Sunday and then watch them every Monday and say, that scene worked, let's write it down. It was never like word for word perfect, except for once. We once actually used the exact word for word as we improvised it. But it's like the process of writing a song.
And do you like, for instance, if you notice, if you have the same people that you do improv with, do you notice you go back to what works every now and then? Like, do you notice? Is it always coming from a natural place, or do you notice yourself going like, oh shit, we're doing this again, or whatever? Like,
exactly. In some ways, it can be a good thing. In some ways, a bad thing. Like the bad is you don't want to just have a bag of tricks. Like certain people are guilty, including myself, of like having a character I know I can pull out and it's going to work. But is it really organic to the scene we're doing now? Or am I just going to bring it out because I know the crowd's going to laugh. And you try not to do that. It's kind of selfish to just force in something you know is going to work for a laugh if it doesn't have to do with the premise of the scene we're already in. But on the other hand, some people, like a basketball team, that we're all good at our different positions in subtle different ways, right? So some people might be better at characters. Some people might only want to do characters, never kind of like just play themselves. And some people might not be comfortable ever playing a character and are rather just play a straight, the voice of reason, the straight man role. So people will fall into that, but I don't consider that cheating. I just consider that people doing their roles, kind of.
Do people who are good at improvisation normally end up in like a writer's room, or is that normally like where that job takes you, or do they end up being actors? What is like the most common like career choice for that?
I'd say both of those, and kind of like the way I just said, some people are more comfortable. Like, if I generalize, I'd say those people who'd rather play a character might not be good in a writer's room, and they might be the ones that are going to excel as the actors.
Oh, okay.
I'm speaking very generally here. And the ones who are the voice of reason are more writerly on stage, and they're the ones throwing out the premise, and they're going to be better. Mm-hmm. Of course, there's exceptions and it goes both ways, but if you're speaking generalities, you might see it that way. But yeah, every writer's room in Hollywood writing comedy shows has someone that started improvising. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The other thing that I heard you say, did you work with him at some point, or was it a completely different generation?
Yeah, he was. He seemed so old when I met him, but he was probably as old as I am now. is the depressing thing. But I was in my 20s in Chicago, and he was the guru. Like, if there was ever a guru, he was at the what was called the ImprovOlympic theater, and that's where his form, the Herald. That's where you went to go see the Herald, and that is and was a known thing in itself, just the form. And that was his place. And he directed my group, the family, in improv. And maybe I should have said that earlier, that why he has such meaning to me. Like, I have so many people like Steve Martin, Andy Kaufman, Monty Python, Kids in the Hall that inspired my comedy more, in that way. And I could talk about in that way. But that guy gave me a tool. Like, he gave me something that made me better as a comedian. I was kind of amazed by it, because I'd have other acting classes before that where they're trying to give you those things. And I don't know if those things ever worked for me personally. But when I got in there was something that clicked where I was like, oh, these things he's teaching are actually working, and they're making scenes better. And that was so exciting to me and the other people I was working with, to the point that our sketch show, like I said, was built on this form, and I consulted with him, and he was the voice that did the intro for the show, actually.
Was it all improvisation, or did you throw away a lot of stuff that was filmed?
It was all written by the time it was filmed, and of course, once you are filming, there's a little improv on set. But no, there wasn't full on improv like we did on stage. It was very complex. What we more were leaning into was the complexity of his form, of how scenes connect, and we had a lot of fun with that. Like and Monty Python had a scene connect into the next scene, but they didn't really have a character for one scene becoming a major player and connecting with a character in another scene. That was more stuff we were playing with, which all came from the philosophies and ideas that we learned from him. It also makes a sketch show more interesting to have, in theory, to have connections and make it more of a story rather than just 5 different sketches. And so we were, even though the show wasn't improvised, we were definitely working with his ideas of the Herald with the written word.
All right, thanks Matt for teaching us on American comedy history, and they'll close. Next week on episode 41, I'm talking to Brother Ali. Make sure to check out my book Accolades, which is still available on craterecords.be/accolades, or subscribe to the podcast. Or if you want to see video footage of this podcast, subscribe to our YouTube channel, Crate Records. Thanks for listening.